my name is Kevin and I collect old irons. In the past videos we've talked about a variety of different irons which were all basically heated directly or indirectly on the tops of stoves. And that meant that you never got very far from that stove environment. In this and some subsequent videos we'll be talking about different technologies that provide internal heat for the irons. Today we'll be talking about the coal irons, and first of all let's just define what we mean by coal, because it can be a couple of things. It can be the hydrocarbon fossil fuel coal, or it can be the charcoal, which is the product of burned wood. And the process of using the coal varied from country, culture, and time. At various times people would start the fire in the iron and develop the fire, nurture that little fire there, and that was by and large the European way of doing things. In the United States, what we would do, particularly in the latter half of the 1800s, where we had very large stoves in those times and easy access to the coals within that stove, is that we would take the coal from the stove and just put it directly into the iron. That gave a heat source within the iron, and we could take that iron and we could take it somewhere else in the house, near a window or something like that. So we are no longer limited by close proximity to the stove, and that was a good idea. Now, as we did with the slug iron video, we will start by talking about the European irons, and then we'll talk about the Americans. This is a early charcoal iron, or coal iron I should say, and goes back to the late 1700s, southern France. I found this in an antique shop in southern Maine for $125 some years ago. It is made by fairly thin sheets of forged metal that are then often riveted together. There's a rather simple latch on the front, and there is a, let's get this thing going, there we are, and a hinge on the back. This particular one has some small holes on the one side, and then has been probably subsequently cut away on the other side to allow for more air to come in. Many of these have various designs in terms of holes along the sides of the iron, and the patterns vary pretty much one iron to every other because they're all handmade. So, late 1700s France. The next iron is about 100 years later. Okay, these are much heavier, made of much thicker metal. There is again an opening near the base of the iron and the top of the iron. There's some vents here. There's a damper in the back, and I can turn this and I can open this and on a back hinge, and I can put coal on the inside. These irons are ubiquitous to late 1800s Europe, and they're very hard to date, they're very hard to place. I think this one's probably German or Austrian because of the gargoyle design on the handle, but you really can't tell. I want you to note the single post handle here and the latch on the front. This particular latch you simply twist to open. Many of these had a quite large weight, and the weight was in the shape of a bird figurine or a human head with different kinds of hats and all kinds of things. And the weight would be pulled back, and that would latch the iron, and then if you wanted to open the iron, you'd push that forward. Again, many variations on this, and we have visited various collections in Europe, and very often they have dozens, if not 100 different variations of this particular kind of iron. I should tell you about these irons that they are made not only in Europe. Some 20 plus odd years ago, there was a time when the antique markets in the United States were saturated in these irons. And all of them very similar, usually had a rooster on the front, oftentimes had a red handle. These are from Mexico. Now, they are not Mexican reproductions. The Mexicans were still making them and using them as irons. It's just that some entrepreneur had the idea of bringing them over here and marketing them as antiques. But the point is that these kinds of irons are still used in many places in the third world today. By the way, this particular iron is our mascot for the Old Iron Inn Bed and Breakfast. I bought this 40 years ago in Vermont. Now, as you may already appreciate, these coal irons in Europe have long histories. And this particular iron, now this is Dutch, and this particular style of iron is as much a characteristic of the Dutch as the wooden shoes. These irons universally used by the Dutch for going back into the 1700s, coming forward into the 1900s. The early ones are oftentimes engraved with designs and initials and years, much as the European slug irons of the same period are. Some less so. I think this one, just judging by the handle and some other subtle features, probably comes from late in that record, early 1900s. But you have to be a little wary. These things are still made in Holland, and they are reproductions. They are made as cheap souvenirs for the tourists, and you do see them fairly often. The modern ones are more lightly constructed. The metal tends to overlap in the back, and there's some other features that can quickly tell you whether these are new or old. But I wanted to mention that for any neophyte collectors out there. The last of the typical European irons we're going to look at is this one here. This is English. Has a bunch of features that are quite English in their general form. It has a latch that moves forward along the sides of the iron. The English coal irons are massively built. They tend to have a chimney that points sideways and points to the right side. The idea being here that a right-handed person would have the chimney pointed away from them as they worked. They also commonly have a shield. The shield is of copper. This one is of tin. I probably have some seasoned iron collectors here, and some of them are probably thinking, why is Kevin using, I get the trivet over here. This is, by the way, an original trivet. Why is Kevin using an iron in such poor condition? And there's a reason for that. I got this iron in company with this one. This is a mother-daughter pair. Again, the mother's not in that good a condition, but I'm entranced by the pair. You do find a lot of irons with a full size and a smaller iron, very similar, that I think probably were original pairs, but these of course then get separated. This is the only time that I've ever seen one of these together, so I'm happy to have that. So that is the European irons. We can now say a few words about the American irons. You may have noticed that these European irons, coal irons, has some features in common. There's a gap between the top of the bottom and the top of the iron. There's some vent holes here. Generally tends to be a fairly simple damper, and get that right, it opens on a back hinge. These are features that you generally see in the European irons, but they're quite different than what you see in the American irons. For the American irons, and this is the Blessin Drake 1852 patent. There's a pin that pulls out of the back and the top lifts off. Now, you get that put back in there. The Blessin Drake was an extremely popular iron throughout the second half of the 19th century. It started with the very high chimney, no shield. In some of the later variations you see a lower chimney, and you do see a shield here. The Blessin Drake is identified with this particular trivet. I think every iron was sold with one of these trivets. These trivets are very common. The trivets also show a classical motif that you seem to see in the Blessin Drakes. I think that is a Greek urn, if you will, and that classical motif is continued on the back of the irons. The Blessin Drakes have this bearded human figure, which is Vulcan, god of fire. And so these are massively built, have a very long history, and that basic style of coal iron in the United States persists for the next 50 years. This is the Hsps company. Very similar construction. These irons, they started building these in the 1880s. This one has a 1904 patent date, and that is on the handle. Interesting thing about this iron, it has a fluter attachment, and I can take the handle off. Takes me a while. Whoa. The handle comes off, and I can use that to flute. And here is the trivet associated with this iron. It's an unusual trivet. It's got a hinged piece to it. And the purpose of that is that I can put the iron on the trivet. Gives it a nice little platform. I can now flute with it, or I can take this side piece off and I can use this to heat tea or use as a hot plate. So, interesting couple of ideas associated with that particular iron. Let's take a look at another American iron of about the same period. This iron does not have any markings on it, but I know for some other very similar irons that this is also in the early 1900s. No markings on this, markings on others. As today, they put their markings on the things that they sold for higher prices in the special catalogs, and they would otherwise sell generic irons. Interesting thing here now, this is again about 1903. This is a full 50 years after the Blessin Drake, and yet it's remarkably the same. It's got the pin in the back, top comes off, very similar kind of shape to it with a chimney. In various of the other iron groups, we saw a marked innovations and competition among various companies. There were not that many companies in the hunt when it came to the American coal irons. We'll do one last of these typical American coal irons. This is the HA Progress iron, patented 1913. And still remarkably what we've been seeing before, except one innovation here, rather than that pin that you have to pull out and then hopefully not lose, they had a little pin device here that stays connected to the top. I find it to be very tough to put this thing back on. But a couple of things about this. First of all, there's another iron that I have markedly similar to this one, and it says on the top Acme, sort of like the Roadrunner cartoons. Acme was a trade name for Sears and Roebuck, and that was the joke in the Roadrunner cartoons. Acme this, Acme that, just like the Sears and Roebuck catalogs. If you look at the Sears and Roebuck listings, and I have some text here from a 1902 catalog, it's really interesting to see the whole litany of all the various iron groups, or at least most of the various iron groups, still represented in the early 1900s. We have flat irons, we have detachable handle irons, we have charcoal irons, all in competition with one another. Interestingly, in the Sears and Roebuck catalog, we do not see the natural gas irons, gasoline irons, and electric irons. They are all now readily available in the early 1900s. The reason you don't see them in the Sears and Roebuck catalog, you instead see flat irons, coal irons, etc., is that the Sears and Roebuck catalog is oriented towards a rural audience. In the urban areas now, they have natural gas piping in the houses and the commercial establishments. They have electrical wiring, but not so in the rural end. We might remember that the rural electrification was a major campaign promise of the Roosevelt administration. I mean Franklin Roosevelt. And so because of the rural market, these irons that we really think of as being from the 1800s persisted for quite an amount of time into the 1900s. We have two more irons to show, and these are these are huge. These mean business, they're built for business. These are irons that would be used by professional tailors. This particular one, built by the Universal Sat Iron Company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The Universal Sat Iron Company made these in 6 to 22 pounds. This one is 18 pounds, full foot long, and a bit different than the other American irons we've seen. The front end here is very robustly built, and the opening is on a back hinge of the European style. Also very ruggedly made. It has a double hull construction on the inside, which I haven't seen elsewhere. The robust construction, the back hinge, and other similarities to the European coal irons suggest to me that this was inspired by some irons that were at that time being manufactured in Germany. This has an 1890 patent date. And let's take a look at another one now. Just as heavy. This is a European iron in the American style. And by the American style, I mean it has a pin here it's in the side rather than the back. And the top lifts off. And this is made by Hsps, which is a Swedish company that is well known, even today I think, in the building of stoves. The iron, again, has no vents on the side. It has a chimney facing forward. Very American style, but it also has something that appeals, I think, to the European audience. The European audience loved dragon lions' heads on the front of their coal irons. This is actually a winged dragon, I think. It's got the hint of two wings here. Although the original for this iron, I think, came from the United States. There is an illustration. I have a citation here from 1854. Iron very similar to this, made out of Cincinnati, with the head turned to the side, but with the dragon head, or at least the eyeballs. So this is a American iron, then copied by the Europeans. So thank you again for joining me. I very much enjoy sharing this lifelong passion that I've had, and I hope you can join me again.